It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon when the Johnson family arrived at the prestigious Grandview Hotel, a luxurious landmark nestled in the heart of the city. For years, they had dreamed of staying at this elegant resort, known for its lavish interiors, top-tier service, and breathtaking views. The family had worked tirelessly for years. Marcus, a successful entrepreneur, and his wife, Andrea, a well-respected lawyer, both had climbed the ladder of success through hard work, sacrifice, and sheer determination. Their two children, Leah and Eli, both in their late teens, were excited for the rare vacation, a time to relax, unwind, and celebrate their hard-won achievements. As the family pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel, Marcus couldn't help but smile. The familiar feeling of success washed over him as he stepped out of the car and gazed at the towering building with its marble facade and glistening glass windows. He had always dreamed of staying here, of treating his family to a life of luxury, and now, after years of grinding, it was finally happening. He could almost hear his grandmother's voice in his head, reminding him that every sacrifice made along the way was worth it. Leah, who had recently graduated from college, marveled at the ornate lobby as they entered. The towering chandeliers, the polished floors, and the scent of fresh flowers made her feel like she had stepped into another world. Eli, a budding musician, eagerly surveyed the surroundings, his mind already filled with the idea of composing something inspired by the luxury that surrounded them. But Andrea, ever the professional, kept her focus on the task at hand, the check-in process. She wanted everything to go smoothly. After all, they had meticulously planned this trip, ensuring everything from the reservation to their accommodations was perfect. They approached the front desk, where a receptionist with a stiff, tight smile greeted them. The woman, probably in her late 20s, was impeccably dressed in a navy blue uniform. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, and she exuded an air of professionalism, at least on the surface. Andrea handed over their reservation confirmation, a standard procedure for anyone checking in at a high-end hotel. The receptionist glanced at the confirmation, her eyes flicking over the names, and there was the briefest moment of hesitation. It was subtle, but Andrea noticed it. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something about the woman's expression shifted, just for a fraction of a second. "Welcome to the Grandview Hotel," the receptionist said, her voice polite, though there was an edge to it that Andrea couldn't ignore. "How may I assist you today?" Andrea smiled warmly. "We're here for a week-long stay. Our reservation should be under Johnson." The receptionist nodded but didn't immediately search the computer system. Instead, she looked back at them, her eyes scanning them more thoroughly than usual. There was something about the way she looked at them that felt off, as if she were trying to place them. After a moment, she began typing, her fingers moving rapidly over the keys, though her gaze never fully left the family. Andrea's patience began to wear thin. It was just a simple check-in. Why the delay? She exchanged a glance with Marcus, who had already started to feel the tension building. They'd been in upscale places before, but this felt different, strangely uncomfortable. After a few moments, the receptionist spoke again, her tone now more formal. "I'm sorry, but it looks like there's an issue with your reservation. Are you sure this is the name under which it was made?" Andrea's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, that's correct. It should be under Johnson." The receptionist clicked her mouse a few more times, her eyes darting between the screen and the family. It seems the system doesn't match up. Are you sure you're in the right place? This is a very high-end establishment. Perhaps you were thinking of another hotel nearby?" Andrea's jaw tightened. Was she being questioned about her family's right to stay here? The insinuation that they didn't belong seemed too blatant to ignore. Leah glanced at Eli, who exchanged a look with his sister. They all knew what was happening here, it was subtle, but unmistakable. The receptionist was assuming that a black family couldn't afford to stay at such an expensive hotel. It wasn't the first time they'd experienced something like this, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. Andrea took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "We've been planning this trip for months," Andrea said, her voice calm but firm. "Please check again. There's been some mistake." The receptionist's eyes flickered as she stared at the screen for another long moment. It was as if she was searching for something beyond the reservation, a reason to prove this family didn't belong. Finally, she looked up at Andrea with a forced smile. "I'll need to check with my supervisor to resolve this." "Just a moment." Andrea's heart sank. She didn't want to escalate things, but she also knew when something wasn't right. The family stood there awkwardly as the receptionist turned and walked to the back office, leaving them in the front lobby. The tension in the air was palpable. The soft hum of distant conversations, the low murmur of the hotel's quiet ambience, all faded as the family exchanged looks of confusion and frustration. "What just happened?" Leah whispered, looking at her parents with disbelief. "She just treated us like we don't belong here." Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the ornate surroundings as if trying to find some reassurance in the luxurious setting. "This is insane. She didn't even give us a chance." Eli, usually the most calm of the group, clenched his jaw. "Are we really going to let her get away with this?" "I don't know, Eli," Marcus replied quietly, his voice edged with frustration. "It's hard to know what to do when you're faced with something like this. Do we fight back, or just let it go?" Andrea stood still, her mind racing. She had dealt with discrimination before, small, subtle acts of bias that left a bitter taste in her mouth, but this felt different. The way the receptionist had treated them, the way she questioned their presence here, was a new level of disrespect. She was furious but also heartbroken. Why was it so hard for some people to see beyond skin color? They were just a family, enjoying a vacation, no different from anyone else. The receptionist returned, her posture stiff. She cleared her throat and made eye contact with Andrea. "I've spoken with my supervisor, and I'm afraid there's been some confusion. Your reservation does appear to be in order after all. I apologize for the misunderstanding." The apology felt hollow, like an afterthought. The receptionist handed Andrea the keys, her demeanor suddenly too polite, too rehearsed. It was as if she hoped this would end the conversation, that they'd accept the apology and move on without causing a scene. But the damage had been done. As the family took the keys, they silently turned to head to their suite. They hadn't been welcomed into this hotel the way they had imagined. The air was thick with disappointment, but as they walked toward the elevators, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The day was supposed to be a celebration, but instead, they were faced with a cruel reminder that no matter how much they achieved, they would always have to fight for their place in the world. The weight of that realization hung heavily over them as the elevator doors closed, leaving the lobby behind. The Johnson family made their way to the elevator in silence, the clinking of the keys the only sound in the otherwise quiet hotel. They were all too stunned to speak at first, each of them processing the incident in their own way. Marcus, always the calm one, felt the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had worked so hard to provide a good life for his family, only to be confronted with something so petty, so unnecessary. Andrea, usually so composed, felt a knot in her stomach. The moment had thrown her off balance, but more than that, it had left her feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had grown accustomed to the subtle prejudices she faced in her career, but this was different. This was a public slap in the face. She could almost hear the receptionist's condescending tone in her mind, as if questioning her very right to be there. Leah, who had always been the more outspoken one in the family, finally broke the silence. "I can't believe she did that. I mean, seriously? It's like she thought we didn't belong here." Her voice was sharp, the hurt evident in her words. Leah had dealt with her fair share of microaggressions, especially as a young black woman navigating spaces that were often overwhelmingly white, but this felt more blatant. The receptionist's actions had been a stark reminder that no matter how successful they became, there were people who would always see them as less than. Eli, the youngest and most reserved of the siblings, had been quiet up until now. He'd been observing the way his parents and sister reacted, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His mind was racing. It wasn't just the racism that bothered him, it was the blatant disrespect. The way the receptionist had looked them up and down, as though trying to place them in some kind of social hierarchy, made his skin crawl. "I don't understand," Eli said softly. "Why does she care so much? Why does it matter who we are or where we come from?" Marcus let out a long, slow breath as the elevator doors slid closed. "That's the thing, son," he said quietly, his voice tight with frustration. "Some people just have this thing in their heads, this idea of who's worthy and who isn't. It's like they have this belief that certain people, certain kinds of people, don't belong in certain spaces." He glanced at Andrea, who had her arms crossed tightly in front of her. "But that's not going to stop us. We've worked hard to get here, to be in a place where we can afford the luxury of staying at this hotel. No one can take that away from us." Andrea nodded but didn't say anything, her thoughts still tangled in a web of emotions. She had been faced with racism before, but it had always been so subtle, so insidious. In her professional life, she had dealt with clients who assumed she wasn't the one in charge because of the color of her skin. She had faced the sideways glances when she entered certain rooms, the feeling that people were looking at her, wondering what she was doing there. But it had always been something she could push to the back of her mind. This, however, felt different. It felt personal. The receptionist had treated them as if they were imposters, as if they didn't belong in a place like this, and that stung more than Andrea had anticipated. The elevator came to a stop, and the doors opened to their suite. It was everything they had hoped for, spacious, elegant, with views of the city skyline that took their breath away. But the beauty of the room couldn't erase the tension they were feeling. They set their bags down quietly, each of them lost in their thoughts. Marcus went to the window, his hands in his pockets as he stared out at the city. He felt the weight of the incident pressing down on him, but he refused to let it ruin their vacation. They had worked hard to get here, and no one, was going to take that from them. "We can't let her ruin this," Marcus said finally, his voice low but firm. "We came here to enjoy ourselves, and that's what we're going to do. She doesn't get to have this kind of power over us." Andrea turned to him, her expression softening. She knew he was right, but the hurt was still there. "It's just, sometimes, it feels like we're always fighting. Like no matter how far we go, no matter what we achieve, it's never enough for some people. They still see us as something less." Leah walked over to them, her arms crossed as she looked at the two of them. "Maybe we should report her. I mean, this isn't right. She shouldn't be allowed to get away with this. No one should." Marcus shook his head, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "We'll see how things play out. I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it has to be, but I agree, this isn't something that should go unnoticed." He paused for a moment before adding, "But I also don't want this to become our entire trip. We can't let this woman define our experience here." Leah didn't respond right away, but she nodded in agreement. She understood the importance of not letting the incident overshadow the vacation, but she also knew her parents had been deeply hurt by it. It was the kind of thing that stuck with you, that lingered long after the initial sting. They spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and getting settled into the suite, but the events of the check-in weighed heavily on their minds. For a while, the tension in the room was palpable, but as the evening wore on, the family found small ways to reconnect. They sat down to a nice dinner in the suite, sharing stories of their day and catching up on each other's lives. It wasn't the joyful, carefree evening they had imagined, but it was enough to remind them of the bond they shared. They would face this together. But as they ate, the thought of what had happened kept creeping back into their minds. They all knew it wasn't just about this one incident. It was a reflection of a larger, uglier truth, one they had all encountered before, but never quite so blatantly in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for everyone. Later that night, as the family gathered on the balcony to watch the sunset, Marcus and Andrea shared a quiet moment together. "You know, babe," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful, "I think this is one of those moments where we have to decide how we want to react. We can either let it eat away at us, or we can choose to rise above it. What do you think?" Andrea leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I think we need to rise above it. For ourselves and for Leah and Eli. We're better than this. But we also need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. No one should have to go through what we just did." Marcus nodded, his eyes still focused on the city below. "You're right. No one should. And we'll figure out a way to make sure they don't." But for now, all they could do was take it one step at a time. The night was still young, and while the hurt lingered, they knew they had a choice, to let this moment define them, or to reclaim their power and their peace. The next morning, the family woke up to a bright, crisp day, the sun filtering through the windows of their suite. The luxury of the hotel, the grandeur of the city below, and the pristine views should have been the perfect backdrop for a peaceful vacation. Yet, the memory of yesterday's encounter with the receptionist lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Despite their best efforts to shake it off, the incident had left an undeniable mark. Over breakfast, the Johnsons sat together in quiet reflection, each of them trying to process what had happened in their own way. Marcus, always the one to keep a level head, was still grappling with the injustice of the situation, but his resolve to protect his family from further harm remained firm. Andrea, too, was trying to move past the sting, but it was hard to ignore the underlying tension in her voice when she spoke. Leah and Eli, though quieter than usual, felt the weight of their parents' emotions. They had seen the way their mom had reacted, the way their dad's hands had clenched in frustration when they'd walked away from the front desk. It was a reminder that no matter how successful or accomplished they became, there would always be people who tried to make them feel like they didn't belong. After breakfast, the family ventured out to explore the city, hoping to take their minds off the incident. They walked through the busy streets, taking in the sights and sounds of the metropolis. The noise of the city, the hum of activity, felt like a welcome distraction. Leah snapped pictures of the architecture, Eli hummed a tune to himself, and Marcus and Andrea shared quiet conversation, trying to keep the peace. Yet, the closer they got to the Grandview Hotel again, the more the weight of what had happened settled in. The luxury of the place had felt almost comforting yesterday, but now, under the shadow of the receptionist's behavior, it seemed more like a gilded cage, a place where they were supposed to feel welcome but instead felt like outsiders. As they returned to the hotel later in the day, Andrea pulled Marcus aside, her expression serious. "We need to do something about what happened yesterday," she said, her voice low. "I can't just let it go. That woman's behavior was unacceptable, and I'm worried about other people being treated the same way." Marcus nodded. He had been wrestling with the same thoughts. He had promised to keep the peace, to not let it ruin their trip, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that silence would only let the problem persist. "I know, babe," he said, his voice steady. "I've been thinking about it too. Maybe we should speak to the manager, let them know what happened. If we don't, it's just going to happen again, and maybe to someone who isn't as prepared to handle it as we were." Andrea looked up at him, her eyes softening with understanding. "Exactly. We have to say something. For us, for Leah, for Eli, for anyone else who might be in the same position." They made their way to the front desk again, this time determined to address the situation. The same receptionist was there, still looking polished, still with that faint, but unmistakable, air of condescension. But this time, instead of backing down, Andrea stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm but composed. "We need to speak to your manager." "Of course, ma'am. I'll call him right away." A few minutes later, a man in his 40s, wearing a sharp suit, arrived at the desk. His name tag read Mr. Edwards. He greeted them with a practiced smile, his handshake a little too firm. "Good afternoon. I'm the manager here at the Grandview Hotel. How may I assist you?" Andrea looked him directly in the eye, her tone polite but unwavering. "We'd like to file a complaint about how we were treated at check-in yesterday. The receptionist was rude, dismissive, and, frankly, discriminatory. She treated us like we didn't belong here, and we feel that needs to be addressed." Mr. Edwards blinked, clearly taken aback. He glanced over at the receptionist, who stood by the side, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm very sorry to hear that. I assure you, that is not the standard of service we strive for here at the Grandview." He turned to the receptionist. "Please give us a moment, and I will speak to you shortly." She nodded quickly, retreating into the back office. Mr. Edwards then turned his attention back to Andrea and Marcus. "I sincerely apologize for your experience. We take these matters very seriously. Can you please tell me exactly what happened?" Andrea took a deep breath, recounting the incident from the moment they arrived at the hotel to the uncomfortable exchange at the front desk. She didn't hold back, and as she spoke, Marcus could see the manager's expression harden, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his face. "I understand, and I can see why this was upsetting for you," Mr. Edwards said once she finished. "I am truly sorry for the way you were treated." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I will personally ensure that this is investigated. Our staff undergoes regular training, and we do not condone this type of behavior. Please allow me to make things right." There was a sincerity in his voice, but Andrea wasn't ready to accept just an apology. She had seen too many situations where apologies were followed by no action. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice steady. "How are you going to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Mr. Edwards seemed to hesitate for a moment, clearly weighing his words. "First, I'll be having a private conversation with the receptionist. I will review the security footage to see exactly how she behaved and take appropriate action. We will also be reviewing our training materials to make sure that this kind of discrimination is addressed head-on." Andrea and Marcus exchanged a look. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice more relaxed now. "We appreciate that." As they walked away from the desk, Andrea felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but only slightly. She knew that standing up for themselves was the right thing to do, but the reality was that it hadn't been easy. "You did great," Marcus said, squeezing her hand as they moved toward the elevator. "It wasn't easy, but you did it." Andrea smiled faintly, grateful for the support. "We did it," she corrected him, glancing at their kids, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange. Leah gave her a thumbs up, her smile wide. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm proud of all of us. We didn't just let it slide." Eli nodded too. "Yeah, we handled it. Together." It felt like a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As they made their way back to their suite, they didn't feel the weight of the world on their shoulders as they had the night before. The experience had changed something in them, but not in the way the receptionist had intended. The Johnsons had faced adversity before, but now, they felt even more united, more resolute. They had stood up for themselves, and they had done so with dignity. The rest of their vacation, though still marked by the memory of the previous day's events, held a new sense of empowerment. They were no longer the silent victims of prejudice. They had taken control of their own narrative, and in doing so, they had shown each other what strength really looked like. The days following their meeting with the hotel manager felt like a quiet turning point for the Johnson family. Though the discomfort of the previous encounter still simmered beneath the surface, there was also a subtle sense of pride that lingered in the air. Andrea felt it every time she walked past the receptionist at the front desk, her eyes catching the woman's, a fleeting acknowledgement that spoke volumes. It wasn't the apology she had wanted, nor was it enough to completely erase the bitterness of the encounter, but it was a step forward. The manager's response had been sincere, and Andrea knew that if there was any chance for systemic change in a place like this, it started with accountability. But the experience had stirred something deeper within her. She realized that as much as she wanted to move on and enjoy the rest of their vacation, she couldn't ignore the feeling that this was part of a larger pattern. It wasn't just about the hotel, it was about a lifetime of these subtle, yet painfully familiar, moments. These little reminders that, no matter how much you achieve, no matter how far you go, there are still people who will see you as less. That thought stuck with her, and by the time she and Marcus sat down to dinner that evening, she knew she needed to do something more. "We've got to keep pushing," she said softly, her voice low as she speared a piece of her salmon. Marcus looked up from his plate, sensing the weight behind her words. "What do you mean?" She set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, her mind made up. "We've had enough of these experiences, right? We've had enough of being the bigger person, of swallowing this stuff just because we have to. It's time we started talking about it. We need to show people how to confront this kind of behavior, not just let it slide." Marcus met her gaze, and for a moment, they shared an understanding that needed no words. They had always been the type to move forward, to look ahead, to focus on their family and their future. But now, Andrea was realizing that the only way to ensure a better future was to make their voices heard in the present. "You're right," Marcus said, nodding slowly. "We can't just let it go. We've got to speak up." That was the decision. They weren't going to let this moment be an isolated incident, and they weren't going to allow anyone else to experience the same humiliation. But as they discussed it further, they also realized that speaking up meant more than just addressing the incident at hand. It meant confronting a societal issue that ran much deeper, and that wasn't going to be easy. In the days that followed, the Johnson family decided to take a proactive approach to ensure their voice would be heard. They began speaking out in small, yet powerful ways. First, Andrea drafted a letter to the hotel's corporate office, outlining what had happened, explaining how it had affected them, and requesting that action be taken not just for them, but to prevent future incidents. She included their personal contact information, not just for the hotel to respond, but to open a channel of communication with anyone who might be in a similar situation. Then, as they walked around the city, they saw the subtle signs of prejudice everywhere. It wasn't always the blatant acts like what they had encountered at the hotel, but the little things, the way a store clerk glanced at them differently, or the way people looked them up and down when they walked into certain establishments. It wasn't so overt that they could call it out in public, but it was there, lingering in the air, in the undercurrents of daily interactions. They began to talk to strangers, speaking openly about the discrimination they had faced, not just in the hotel but in other parts of their lives. They didn't want to be labeled as complainers or troublemakers, but they understood now that silence only allowed the prejudices to continue. Slowly, they realized that every conversation they had was a form of resistance. A way to fight back without ever throwing a punch. It became less about what they could do in response to this specific incident and more about how they could use their voices to create lasting change. Andrea started sharing her experiences on social media, writing blog posts about the challenges Black families faced when traveling, how microaggressions like the one they had encountered at the hotel were often brushed off as trivial. She shared the letter she had sent to the hotel, not for sympathy, but as an example of what it meant to speak up. She encouraged others who had been in similar situations to do the same. The response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from people who had encountered similar issues, and many of them expressed gratitude for Andrea's willingness to speak out. The Johnsons started to receive messages from other travelers, some of whom had been in hotels, restaurants, and stores where they had felt marginalized, and all of them expressed a desire to be heard. It became clear that the problem wasn't isolated to just their experience, it was everywhere. Marcus, too, started to use his platform in his professional life to speak about issues of discrimination. He was a successful entrepreneur, and he realized that his position allowed him to reach more people than he ever thought possible. He began giving talks at conferences, using his influence to push for diversity in business and advocate for equal treatment in spaces where people of color had long been excluded. In every conversation, whether with a friend, a colleague, or a stranger, Marcus emphasized the importance of confronting racism head-on. As the days of their trip went on, the family found themselves growing stronger in the face of adversity. The more they spoke out, the more empowered they felt. They began to take pride in their willingness to challenge the status quo, even if it made others uncomfortable. The hotel manager had taken their complaints seriously, but now it was about something larger, something that would take more than just one conversation to fix. The experience with the receptionist had ignited something in them, something they hadn't realized was there before, a fire to speak out, to make sure others didn't have to go through what they had. Their vacation continued, but it was no longer just about relaxation or enjoying the sights. It had become something bigger. It had become a journey of awakening, an awakening that, no matter how much they achieved or how far they went, they would never stop fighting for what was right. They would never stop challenging the biases that sought to diminish them. And, in doing so, they would be creating a ripple effect, one conversation at a time, that might just help change the world. The days following their decision to speak out about the incident at the hotel passed in a blur of activity and reflection. As the Johnsons moved through the remainder of their vacation, they found themselves not just going through the motions but actively engaging with the world around them in a way they had never done before. Every interaction seemed to carry weight now. Every person they encountered had the potential to either reinforce the silence they had grown so accustomed to or challenge it, just as they had done. One evening, a few days after their meeting with the hotel manager, Andrea and Marcus sat down together, their usual evening routine of winding down taking on a new tone. The kids were in their rooms, and the quiet of the suite made the air feel heavier with anticipation. Andrea, always the thoughtful one, stared out the window at the city lights below. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Marcus, leaning back in his chair with a deep sigh, looked at her, his eyes a little worn but resolute. "I think it's about changing the conversation. Look, we can't change the world in a day, but if we speak up, if we encourage others to do the same, maybe we can make a dent in it." He paused for a moment, the weight of their discussion settling in. It's not just about one incident. It's about creating a space where this stuff isn't acceptable anymore. Where people can't get away with it. Andrea nodded slowly, absorbing his words. The truth was, they had known for a long time that silence was just as harmful as the act of prejudice itself. But speaking out was risky, there were always consequences to challenging the status quo. Still, the idea of allowing things to stay the way they were, of letting future generations deal with the same issues, was more painful than any of the potential consequences they might face now. "What if people think we're just complaining?" she asked, a small but genuine fear creeping into her voice. "What if they don't see the bigger picture?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression softened but firm. "We can't worry about that. We've got to do this for ourselves, for Leah, for Eli. If no one else has the courage to speak up, then we will." They both fell quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The experience had changed them, but in a way that was still evolving. It wasn't just about confronting one rude receptionist or sending a letter to the hotel management. It was about reclaiming their power and their narrative. For so long, they had lived their lives in a world where their success and accomplishments were often overshadowed by the color of their skin. They had been conditioned to accept microaggressions as part of the package of success, to tolerate the moments when people would make them feel less than, even when they had more than proven their worth. But no more. They had shown that they were no longer willing to accept the invisible chains of prejudice. Andrea knew, deep down, that speaking out had already started a shift, not just in their own family, but in the people around them. She had already heard from so many people who had shared their own stories of similar experiences, and it was clear that the hotel was not the only place where this kind of behavior was prevalent. But speaking up wasn't easy, and it came with its own set of challenges. As their letters and blog posts began to circulate, Andrea started receiving more messages, some of support, but others from people who were skeptical, even dismissive of their efforts. She had known this would happen, but it was still painful to read some of the comments. Some of the messages were kind, from people who thanked her for bringing awareness to an issue they themselves had faced. Others, though, were less supportive. "You just want attention," one comment read. "This kind of thing happens everywhere, get over it." It stung, but Andrea kept going, reminding herself that those who were critical often hadn't experienced what she had. They hadn't walked through life with the knowledge that their success and achievements were always questioned, always scrutinized, simply because of the color of their skin. Despite the negativity, Andrea and Marcus pushed forward, motivated by the messages of support they received, by the small victories they achieved in their personal lives, and by the quiet but consistent ripple of change that began to unfold around them. As they spoke at more events, both formal and informal, they realized that their efforts were having an impact. Slowly but surely, people were beginning to listen. The conversation about race and privilege in the city began to evolve in a way that had never happened before. They started to see more businesses, hotels, and restaurants taking a proactive stance on diversity and inclusion. And while it was still a long road ahead, it was a road that was no longer defined by silence. One afternoon, nearly a month after their trip, they received an email from the Grandview Hotel's corporate office. The subject line read, "Response to your complaint." Andrea opened it with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The email was from the corporate head of customer relations, and it started with a formal apology. But what caught her attention was the second paragraph: "We take all matters related to discrimination and guest experiences very seriously, and we are committed to taking action. As a result of your complaint, we have instituted a new diversity training program for all of our front desk staff and management. Additionally, we are reviewing our policies to ensure that this kind of behavior does not occur again. Your feedback is invaluable, and we thank you for bringing this matter to our attention." It was a step. It wasn't a grand, sweeping change, but it was change nonetheless. The hotel was taking action, responding to their call for accountability. The Johnsons didn't know what the future held, but they had already made a difference. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, they realized something profound. Their fight had not been just for them, it had been for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. It had been for every black family who had walked into a space and been made to feel less than. The letter from the hotel was proof that their voices had been heard, but more than that, it was proof that change was possible. It was proof that, even in the face of adversity, standing up and speaking out could create a ripple effect. As Leah and Eli finished their dinner, Marcus looked at them with a sense of pride. "You guys should be proud," he said softly. "You saw what we did, and you understood why it mattered. That's how we make the world a better place." Andrea reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "This is just the beginning." And for the first time in a long time, they felt a sense of peace. Their journey had just begun, and it was a journey they would continue together, one where their voices would always be heard. And as they walked into the future, they would no longer be the quiet ones in the back. They would be the ones leading the charge, reminding the world that no one should ever be made to feel less than. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change and growth for the Johnson family. Their decision to speak out had sparked more than just a personal transformation, it was a catalyst for a larger shift that was beginning to ripple through their community. Andrea and Marcus found themselves at the heart of conversations that had long been avoided in the public sphere. At first, it was small, an invitation to speak at a community event, a local podcast interview, or a quick chat with neighbors who wanted to learn more about their experience. But soon, their reach began to grow. As more people heard their story, the Johnsons found themselves part of a bigger movement. There were moments when it felt overwhelming. They had never expected their actions to lead to such a widespread impact. They didn't set out to be activists, they were just a family who wanted to make sure that their experience wasn't swept under the rug. But the more they engaged with others, the more they realized how many people were silently bearing similar burdens. Their voices, once isolated in frustration, had found an echo in countless others. It wasn't long before they were invited to speak at a national conference focused on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. The idea of standing before hundreds of people, many of whom were business owners, HR professionals, and community leaders, felt like a daunting responsibility. Yet, it also felt like the next logical step. They had become the very voice they had wished to hear when they were younger, when they faced discrimination and bias without anyone acknowledging it. As they prepared for their presentation, they spent hours reflecting on their journey, from the first moment of humiliation at the hotel to their decision to speak out, to the positive changes that had followed. They weren't just recounting an incident anymore. They were speaking about the broader issues of systemic racism and the importance of standing up against it, not just in big, dramatic moments, but in everyday interactions. On the day of the conference, Marcus and Andrea stood backstage, waiting for their turn to take the stage. They had been through so much together as a family, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just about sharing their story, it was about setting a precedent for the future. "Do you think they'll get it?" Andrea asked, her voice laced with both nervousness and hope. Marcus looked at her, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "They have to. We're not here to play nice. We're here to make sure they understand why this matters." He squeezed her hand, and they stepped onto the stage together, the lights dimming as they began to speak. For the next hour, they shared their story in front of an audience that hung on every word. They spoke not only about the incident at the hotel but about the toll that racial discrimination takes on individuals, families, and communities. They explained how racism isn't always overt. It can be subtle, a slight glance, an unspoken assumption, but its effects are no less damaging. They talked about how silence perpetuates harm and how essential it is for people to find their voice, even when it's uncomfortable. When they finished, the applause was deafening. It wasn't just applause for a well-delivered speech, it was applause for the honesty, the vulnerability, and the courage they had shown. As they walked off the stage, Andrea felt a mixture of exhaustion and pride wash over her. This was the beginning of something bigger than she had ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, they began receiving more invitations to speak, to share their story, and to engage with communities and organizations that were working to address the very issues they had highlighted. What began as an effort to challenge one hotel's discriminatory behavior had blossomed into a platform for systemic change. But it wasn't just about public speaking. The Johnson family began to realize the true impact of their work when they started to see tangible change in their own lives. It wasn't that the world was suddenly perfect, but it was different. At the same time, they were still navigating challenges. They encountered backlash from some of the hotel's loyal patrons, who believed that the incident had been blown out of proportion. But rather than backing down, the Johnsons used this as an opportunity to engage in dialogue, showing that the true problem was not the isolated incident, but the societal structures that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. They began to see more and more people becoming allies, reaching out to them privately or through social media to express their support and share their own stories of confronting bias in their own lives. The most rewarding part, though,